In the first scene, Whip Whitaker, who had spent the previous night drinking, using drugs, and having sex with Caterina Marquez, one of his plane's flight attendants, wakes up in a hotel room before it's time to board a new aircraft. He picks up the phone when his ex-wife Deanna calls while still attempting to shake off his hangover. Whip refuses to talk to Deanna about enrolling their son in a private school right now, saying he'll do so when he returns to Atlanta. Deanna wants to talk about enrolling their son in a private school. Whip cannot calm down until he snorts a line of cocaine, while Caterina swiftly departs for the airport to get ready. This awakens him up, and he immediately makes his way to the airport, where it is pouring rain and the aircraft are being battered. Whip conducts a short inspection of the aircraft before boarding and chatting with Margaret, a flight attendant, as well as his co-pilot Ken Evans. Whip, who is wearing sunglasses and gets hit by his oxygen mask, makes Ken a bit uneasy, but he believes him when he says he is fine to fly. Whip accelerates the aircraft as it lifts off in the rain in an effort to find a gap in the clouds. Whip instructs Ken to inform flight control that they are slightly deviating from their scheduled course to avoid the weather as they fly through the weather system. But when Whip finds a gap in the storm, the aircraft settles, and the passengers cheer. Shortly after departure, Whip personally apologizes to the guests for the bumpy flight while stealthily putting 3 mini vodka bottles into an orange juice bottle. Whip returns to the cockpit and takes a snooze after throwing the bottles in the trash and handing the controls to Ken.
A prostitute named Nicole leaves a motel after spending the night with a client in a small Georgian town and uses her cell phone to call a drug dealer. She visits the man at his home where a pornographic movie is being made and purchases a tiny amount of heroin from him. He cautions her not to shoot too much because the film hasn't been trimmed properly. He also offers her a part in the movie, but she declines and walks away. She returns home to find her shady complex manager in her residence. He advances on her sexually as they dispute over her due rent. She entices him outside before slamming the door in his face. She finds a hypodermic needle among her belongings, uses it to inject the narcotics she got from her connection, overdoses, and loses consciousness. Whip is dozing off in his chair while Ken keeps an eye on the plane when it is in flight. Margaret is astounded by Whip's capacity for deep slumber and informs Ken that he would have to awaken Whip in order to get him ready for their landing. When the plane receives a severe shock and swings into an uncontrollable dive, Ken is just about to. Both the steering wheels and the plane's hydraulic controls are non-responsive. Whip, who is remarkably composed, ditches the plane's fuel and attempts a number of various emergency maneuvers to regain control of the aircraft. He asks Margaret to assist him and Ken in the cockpit and tells her son she loves him because of the flight recorder. Before Whip undertakes a risky maneuver, rolling the plane so they're flying inverted, all of his attempts to right the jet fail. This will afford them some time to find a safer landing location. When the plane lurches dramatically, one of the stewardesses, Camilla, who had been helping some of the passengers, is knocked out cold. The plane rolls, pitching her onto the cabin ceiling. When the plane rolls over, a young boy slips out of his seat. Caterina unbuckles herself, picks him back up, and rebuckles him. Whip inverts the aircraft once more with Ken and Margaret's assistance, leveling it out, and then rolls it to crash land on its belly in a field close to a tiny church. The wing of the aircraft collides with the church's tower, ripping it off. Whip is knocked unconscious when the ground contact forces his head against the steering yoke. Whip regains consciousness only in time to witness Ken slumped over in his seat, bleeding heavily from his skull, and himself being hauled out of the aircraft by the local parishioners. Additionally, bleeding and yelling, "Margaret!" A steel plate covering Caterina's skull indicates that she is dead. Her body is also found close to Margaret. We observe Nicole being carried out on a stretcher as the jet flies inverted precisely over her apartment building just before it crash lands. Whip discovers Charlie Anderson, Bruce Greenwood, a buddy, waiting for him when he awakens in a hospital. Charlie tells Whip, off the record, that there were 6 fatalities, including Caterina and Camilla as well as 4 passengers, despite his assertion that Whip's maneuver saved many lives. Soon after, Harling Mays, a friend of Whip's, pays him a visit. John Goodman. Whip requests some apparel and items from Harling's house, and Harling responds by bringing him some cigarettes and some extras. Harling laughs about the care Whip is receiving, suggesting that Whip demand better drugs. Harling also informs Whip that the media visited his house and the hospital as a result of his bravery during the collision. One evening, Whip enters a stairwell in search of a place to smoke and runs into Nicole. Soon after, Mark, a cancer patient, joins them, James Badge Dale. Soon after learning who Whip is, the cancer patient shifts the subject to God and whether or not calamities can be avoided. Mark believes that nothing can be done to prevent events from occurring. In the same way that the three were destined to meet in the stairs and Whip was intended to land that jet, he believed that getting cancer was fate. Whip informs Nicole that he would like to see her after they are discharged from the hospital after Mark leaves, and she provides him with her address. When Whip is eventually freed, Harling takes him out the back door to avoid being seen by the media outside the hospital. Whip asks Harling to take him to his father's old farmhouse in the country, where a small Cessna is kept in a neighboring garage, knowing that the media have descended on his home. Whip searches the entire house for the alcohol that is kept there and dumps it all out. He also gets rid of a little bit of marijuana. Whip doesn't reply to any of the messages left on his phone, so he's astonished when Charlie calls him at the farm and tells him to see him after a doctor's appointment a few days from now. Whip agrees to the request and attends a meeting with Hugh Lang, Don Cheadle, a Chicago attorney who has been appointed by the pilots' union. Hugh explains that when Whip's blood was taken from him at the scene of the accident, it revealed he had cocaine in his system and a high blood alcohol content. The two tell Whip that Hugh will contest the results but that Whip might be charged with manslaughter, go to jail, and lose his pilot's license. Whip reacts poorly to the news and immediately leaves for a liquor store. When he tries to locate Nicole's address, he discovers that the landlord has just evicted her from her flat. Whip is able to assist her with her rent payments and offers to let her stay with him because she has nowhere else to go and her car won't start. Whip continues to avoid the media during the following few days, but he soon comes to the realization that those around him might be responsible for damaging his reputation. He meets Margaret during Katerina's funeral, and Margaret states that when she first met Whip that morning, she could tell he was inebriated. Whip then begins to get personal, saying that if it weren't for him, she may have also perished. Whip stops by Ken's hospital room. Ken explains that he didn't share his concerns about Whip's condition at the time with the National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB), which has been looking into the disaster. Ken is aware of Margaret's activities and that Whip was maybe intoxicated in the cockpit at the time of the tragedy. Ken and his wife think that his survival was a miracle, despite the fact that he might never walk again. Whip hesitantly joins the couple in prayer because they are adamant about it. Nicole has been reclaiming her life in the interim by finding employment and going to meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous. She invites Whip to go with her, but he finds the meeting to be quite unpleasant. Soon after, Nicole discovers Whip repairing the Cessna in his dad's garage. Whip, who has been drinking, yells angrily after Nicole as she leaves after refusing his advances that they may fly away and start over. Whip eventually loses Nicole, and his drinking spirals out of hand. After the media locates the farmhouse, he leaves and drives into the area where his ex-wife and son live. Both demand that he go, but Whip won't budge, so they decide to report him to the police. Whip's actions have enraged Charlie and Hugh, who believe that this does not augur well for their future case with the NTSB. Whip still needs to give his side of the tale to Ellen Block, Melissa Leo, the NTSB investigator, despite Hugh's success in getting Whip's alcohol test overturned on a technicality. They are aware that Block is a fair investigator who will be tough when discussing Whip's state just prior to the collision. They persuade Whip to change his ways, and the night before the hearing, he is led to a hotel room. The mini fridge in the room has been thoroughly cleaned, and there is a security guard stationed at the door. Whip tries to unwind, but he can't even fall asleep or read the papers Hugh has prepared for him. He then hears a banging noise. He quickly discovers that it goes to the room next to his, whose door has been left unlocked. He discovers a mini fridge that is completely loaded with alcohol in the space. Whip briefly scans the food in the refrigerator and even opens a bottle of vodka. He hesitates before drinking the bottle, sets it down on the desk, and then walks away. He comes back a little while later and snags the bottle. When Charlie and Hugh arrive the following day and Whip doesn't answer the door, they discover him unconscious in the bathtub with a cut on his head and numerous empty mini bottles all over the place. They come up with a bold strategy as the hearing draws closer and call in Harling Mays, who gives Whip the cocaine he needs to get rolling. Whip, Charlie, and Hugh go to the hearing after paying Harling. A faulty jackscrew in the tail section that had not been repaired a few years earlier was found to be the accident's primary cause during the hearing, which was presided over by Ellen Block. The dive was brought on by the jackscrew forcing the tail stabilizer into the down position. Whip appears to be cleared by the disclosure, but Ellen later brings up the discovery of 2 empty mini alcohol bottles in one of the garbage cans close to the pilot's cabin. Only one other member of the flight crew may have possibly stolen the vodka, given the blood test results, of which Whip's has been thrown out due to obsolete equipment and process in collecting his blood. Katerina, who has a history of drinking and drug misuse. Whip replies that he was unaware of Katerina's past when questioned if he was aware of it. Whip hesitates before admitting that he drank the vodka when Ellen asks if it's conceivable that Katerina drank the alcohol. Whip refuses Charlie and Hugh's efforts to quiet him, admitting that he has alcohol problems and that he has taken cocaine. He also claims that he is now inebriated. After the hearing, Whip joins us in a small group of inmates in a prison. Whip tells the others about his admission and how, it seemed, the NTSB hearing was the turning point in his lying. He was unable to utter any more lies. 13 months later, Whip has cleaned himself during his time in prison and earned the trust of his ex-wife and children once more. Soon after, his son pays him a visit and asks to interview him for a report in order to learn more about his father, who seemed to have been missing for the majority of his life. Whip nods cheerfully in agreement.